A single glance at a stranger's screen was about to unravel a woman the whole business world thought it had figured out. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, stay with this one and subscribe because it's really about you. Brennan Ashford came to fix a broken computer. That was all he expected on that gray Seattle morning, the rain falling in the soft, endless way it always did in autumn, wrapping the glass towers downtown in silver mist. He had no idea that within an hour his whole life would tilt. That one look at a screen would pull him into the orbit of a woman the industry believed it understood and did not understand at all. He carried his tool bag over one shoulder, walked into the lobby of Arden Quantum Systems, and thought only about the invoice he'd send once the job was done. He could not have guessed that the woman running that billion-dollar company was about to ask him a question that would change both of their lives. For almost 6 years, Brennan had lived a quiet, nearly invisible life. He took freelance contracts, fixing corporate networks, patching servers, untangling the kind of technical disasters that made junior engineers panic. He did the work well, charged fair prices, and never advertised that he'd once designed security architecture for one of the largest defense contractors on the West Coast. He'd walked away from that career after his marriage ended and his son grew old enough to build a life 2,000 miles away. Brennan didn't talk about that chapter. He worked with his hands, fixed what was broken, and went home to an apartment that held more silence than furniture. He told himself he liked it that way. There was a kind of peace in being underestimated. Clients saw a man in his 40s with graying stubble and a canvas jacket and assumed he was another contractor pulled from a staffing agency. They never asked about the 17 years he'd spent behind classified clearance walls solving problems most people would never be allowed to hear about. He preferred it. Recognition had cost him too much once, and he'd learned to live smaller, quieter, safer. That morning, an emergency request came through his usual channel marked urgent, paying triple his normal rate. The company was Arden Quantum Systems, one of the fastest rising names in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity on the coast. Brennan had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the tech corridor had. What he hadn't expected was the tension radiating off every employee he passed once he stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor. A junior assistant met him near reception, her hands not quite steady as she clipped a visitor badge to his jacket. She lowered her voice as if the walls might report her. The computer belonged to the chief executive herself, a woman named Celeste Arden, and Ms. Arden was, in the assistant's careful phrasing, extremely particular. 3 technicians had already tried and failed over the past 3 days, and each had left looking rattled as though they'd walked out of an interrogation rather than an office. Brennan only nodded. He'd worked under generals and defense officials who didn't tolerate excuses, and a demanding executive didn't frighten him. What caught his attention was a detail buried in the ticket. The machine wasn't merely slow or frozen. It was rejecting every attempt at repair as if something inside it was actively resisting help. That interested him far more than any warning about a difficult boss. The office was empty when he entered, and it didn't look like the office of a typical executive. No framed magazine covers, no trophies, no furniture arranged to intimidate. Just a plain wooden desk, a wall of windows over the rain-soaked skyline, and a single terminal glowing in the muted light. It looked less like the headquarters of a woman worth hundreds of millions, and more like the workspace of someone who wanted to be left alone. Brennan set his bag down and studied the frozen screen before he touched a key. The system had locked into a strange loop, refreshing every few seconds, rejecting every command. He'd seen this only a handful of times in his career, and each time it had meant something more interesting than a simple malfunction. He pulled a small diagnostic drive from his bag, inserted it, and began the patient work of listening to what the machine was trying to tell him, unaware that within minutes he'd be staring at a photograph never meant for his eyes. The IT team had spent 3 full days on this machine and walked away beaten every time. They were sharp engineers by any measure, trained quick under pressure. But this had resisted every conventional fix. They'd reinstalled software, swapped hardware, run diagnostic sweeps that should have caught any obvious corruption. Nothing worked. The system just refused to behave, freezing at random, rejecting commands, occasionally flashing errors that made no logical sense for the architecture involved. Brennan crouched beside the terminal and watched the failures scroll past for several minutes before touching anything. He'd learned long ago that most people rush to fix a problem before they understand it, and that rushing almost always made things worse. Within a few minutes, he saw what the others had missed. a subtle timing conflict buried in the background processes invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't an outside hacker. It was something more mundane and to him more interesting. Two separate AI systems installed on the same machine were fighting each other for the same resources, each trying to optimize the system by different priorities, neither aware the other existed. The kind of collision that only happens when too many departments layer their own tools on top of one another without ever coordinating. He opened a command window, reallocated the resources by hand, and rewrote 3 lines of a configuration file nobody else had thought to open. The fix took him 20 minutes, a fraction of the time the previous team had spent failing to understand the problem in the first place. When the machine finally stabilized, the assistant who'd let him in stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the screen as if she'd witnessed something impossible. Word moved through the floor within minutes, employees whispering that the contractor in the canvas jacket had solved in 20 minutes what an entire department couldn't crack in 3 days. As the system rebooted a final time, the screen went black, then settled into its home display. Brennan expected a company logo, the polished branding every corporate machine loaded by default. Instead, a photograph filled the screen. It was a young woman standing in the rain, her hair damp and tangled across her forehead, her laughter caught mid-motion as though someone had snapped the picture without warning her. No makeup, no styling, no trace of the untouchable persona that dominated every business magazine cover he'd ever glimpsed. Just a woman fully alive in a single moment, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with joy. Brennan found himself looking longer than he should have, caught by something he couldn't name, some quiet ache in the sincerity of that smile. He was still looking when the door opened behind him, and the air in the room seemed to change. Celeste Arden entered the way she entered every room, with a composed authority that made junior staff straighten without thinking. She was 37, one of the youngest chief executives in the entire AI sector, a woman whose name appeared in industry publications beside words like formidable and untouchable. Her gray suit fit with surgical precision, her dark hair pulled back into a style that left no room for softness. Her expression carved from something that resembled patience, but was closer to exhaustion, carefully disguised. She'd built a reputation over most of a decade for being nearly impossible to read, and very few people in her professional life had ever seen anything like vulnerability cross her face. She stopped just inside the doorway when she saw the man beside her desk, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes, something between alarm and recognition, before her expression smoothed back into its mask. Her gaze moved past him and landed on the screen. On the photograph she kept as her personal wallpaper, precisely because no one on her staff ever had reason to look at it. For one suspended moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched thick enough that even the assistant near the door seemed to stop breathing. Brennan understood at once that he'd stumbled into something private, something this woman had never meant to share with a stranger who'd walked in only to fix a machine. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain the image had simply appeared when the system rebooted. But before he could get a word out, Celeste crossed the room, stopped directly in front of him, and studied his face with an intensity that made the rest of the office fall away. Nobody in that room ever looked directly at the chief executive's screen. It was an unspoken rule, one of many small survival habits that had grown up over years of working beneath a woman who valued her privacy the way other people valued oxygen. Brennan knew he'd broken it without meaning to, and he began shaping an apology. Some careful combination of professionalism and discretion that might smooth the moment over. He never got to say it. Celeste's eyes stayed fixed on him, searching for something he couldn't identify. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than he expected, almost fragile beneath its practiced calm, as though the question had been waiting behind her ribs a long time and had slipped free before she could stop it. "Do you think I'm pretty?" she asked. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. The assistant near the door went perfectly still. 2 other employees who'd gathered to watch the miraculous repair traded a glance, unsure they'd actually heard their chief executive ask something so personal, so completely unlike the guarded woman they thought they knew. Celeste Arden did not ask questions like that. She did not reveal uncertainty, not in board meetings, not in interviews, not in the negotiations where her icy composure had become a kind of legend. Brennan didn't answer right away. He'd learned long ago in his marriage, and in the years after it collapsed, that some questions were never really about what they appeared to be. A person doesn't ask a stranger whether they're pretty because they care about a stranger's opinion of their face. They ask because somewhere beneath that simple question sits a much larger, much older one that's been building quietly for years, waiting for a moment when the walls slip just enough to let it through. He looked past her shoulder at the photograph still glowing on the screen at the young woman laughing in the rain with no audience and no performance required of her. And he understood exactly what Celeste was really asking. Not whether her face pleased him. Whether that other version of herself, the one caught in that unguarded moment years ago, still existed anywhere at all, or whether it had been swallowed whole by the armored woman standing in front of him. He chose his words with care, the way he'd once chosen words in rooms where a wrong sentence could cost lives. "That photograph is beautiful," he said, "because the woman in it is happy. That's what makes it beautiful. Not the light, not the angle. Nothing anyone could stage on purpose." Celeste went very still. For a moment her composure wavered just enough for him to catch a faint tremor along her jaw before she caught it and smoothed it away. In 7 years of running the company, she'd been told she was beautiful more times than she could count by investors trying to charm her, by reporters hunting an easy headline, by men who mistook her success for an invitation. Not one of them had ever looked past her face to the feeling underneath it. Not one had ever noticed that the woman in that photograph was happy, and that the woman in this office hadn't felt anything close to it in longer than she cared to admit. She turned away for a moment, composing herself, her hand resting briefly against the edge of the desk, as though she needed something solid to hold. When she turned back, her expression had returned to its professional calm, but something in her eyes had shifted, some door left open that had been sealed for years. She thanked him for the repair in a tone that sounded almost rehearsed, and the small crowd began drifting back to their desks, whispering about what they'd just seen. Before Brennan could gather his tools, Celeste asked him to stay a little longer. She didn't explain why. She simply said the words quietly, as if surprised to hear herself say them, and Brennan found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered what he was agreeing to. The formal request came the next afternoon, delivered not through the usual channels, but in a personal message from Celeste's office. She wanted him to remain with the company for a while, officially as a security consultant, though the specifics were left deliberately vague. The offer surprised nearly everyone who heard it, including Brennan, who'd assumed his work there had ended the moment the computer rebooted. Not everyone welcomed the news. Several senior directors voiced open frustration in meetings he wasn't invited to but heard about anyway through office gossip. A contractor who fixed broken laptops now had access to sensitive systems and worked in close proximity to the chief executive without any of the vetting the rest of leadership had spent years accumulating. Some accused him quietly but pointedly of engineering his way into Celeste's confidence for reasons that had nothing to do with security. Brennan heard the whispers and let them pass. He'd never cared much for office politics, and he cared even less now because his only real interest lay in the technical mystery still buried in the company's network. The collision between the two AI systems on Celeste's machine was, he suspected, a symptom of something larger. Systems didn't just crash into each other like that without a reason, and the deeper he looked into the infrastructure, the more that instinct held. Over the following days, he worked in a small office near the server room, reviewing logs. Most employees never bothered to open tracing patterns of activity that seemed at first glance unremarkable. It was only when he cross-referenced access times against departmental schedules that something began to feel wrong. Certain files were being pulled at hours when no legitimate business justified it, moved through channels that bypassed the usual monitoring disguised well enough that an ordinary audit would have missed them. Someone inside Arden Quantum Systems was quietly extracting proprietary data and had been doing it long enough to grow dangerously confident in their own invisibility. Brennan said nothing to anyone yet. Hard experience had taught him that accusations without proof destroy careers as thoroughly as the crimes themselves, and he meant to be certain before he spoke a single word. He kept gathering evidence in silence, not knowing that the answers he was chasing would soon collide with the careful friendship forming between him and the woman who'd hired him. Celeste began seeking him out more often than the arrangement strictly required. At first, the visits wore a professional pretense, a question about a protocol, a request to review an unusual login, some excuse to appear near his office without admitting the real reason. Gradually, the pretenses wore thin until she simply showed up some evenings after most of the staff had gone home, carrying 2 cups of coffee and settling into the chair across from his desk as though it were the most natural thing in the world. It was during one of those quiet evenings, rain streaking the windows behind her, that she finally told him about the photograph. It had been taken years earlier, before the company existed in its current form, before her father's illness forced her to abandon her own plans and step into a role she'd never asked for. In the picture, she was 26, soaked from a sudden downpour outside a small cafe near the university, laughing at something a friend had said seconds before the shutter clicked. Back then, she wore no makeup, most days cared little for appearances, and measured her worth by entirely different standards than the ones that governed her life now. She'd wanted to work in academic research, studying systems far removed from boardrooms and shareholder calls. That version of her life ended when her father was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and within 18 months, she was thrust into the chief executive's chair of a company she barely understood, expected to project unshakable confidence to investors already looking for a reason to doubt a woman so young. From that point on, she said, nobody around me ever asked whether I was happy. They asked about quarterly earnings, market share, stock valuation, positioning against rivals. Somewhere in all those years, the woman in that photo just disappeared and this one took her place. The industry respects her. Sometimes it's afraid of her. It almost never understands her. Brennan listened without interrupting, recognizing in her words an echo of something he'd lived. He didn't lay out the details of his own collapse, the marriage that ended under the weight of ambitions that no longer matched the grinding years afterward spent rebuilding a life stripped to its simplest form. He understood in a way words couldn't quite hold exactly how it felt to lose yourself so gradually that you barely notice the disappearance until it's already complete. He offered no advice, no reassurance dressed up as wisdom. He simply sat with her in the silence, and for reasons neither of them examined, the silence felt like enough. "You didn't ask me why I keep it as the wallpaper," she said after a while, nodding at the dark screen. "Everyone else who's ever glimpsed it looked away and pretended they hadn't." "I figured you kept it where you'd have to see it every day," Brennan said. "People don't do that with things they've made peace with." She was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup a slow quarter turn on the desk. "No," she said finally. "I suppose they don't." It was the closest she'd come in years to admitting out loud that some part of her was still trying to find the way back to that morning in the rain. The crisis arrived without warning on a Thursday when the company discovered a massive breach had exposed sensitive proprietary data to outside parties. The scale of the leak was staggering, threatening not only the company's competitive position, but several partnerships with government contractors who demanded absolute confidentiality as a condition of working together. Panic spread through the executive floor within hours, board members demanding answers, lawyers drafting statements, public relations bracing for a media storm. And within the chaos, suspicion turned almost immediately toward Brennan. Security footage appeared to show him accessing restricted servers late at night, on dates and times that lined up suspiciously well with the breach. Several board members, already uneasy about his presence, seized on the footage as proof of exactly what they'd feared, that an unvetted outsider had been handed far too much access far too quickly. They called for his immediate removal and threatened legal action that could follow him for years. Celeste found herself at the center of an impossible choice. On one side stood her entire board, seasoned executives with decades of combined experience presenting what looked like damning evidence. On the other stood a man she'd known a matter of weeks, a contractor with no formal title whose only real credential in her eyes was the quiet integrity she'd seen firsthand in the hours they'd shared after the office emptied. Every rational argument favored trusting her board. Every instinct she had told her otherwise. She called an emergency meeting late that evening, gathering the board, her legal counsel, and Brennan into one room, the tension so thick it felt physical. The footage played on the main screen, timestamps glowing beneath grainy images that looked at first glance undeniable. Board members spoke over one another, demanding termination and a full investigation into how such a lapse had been allowed under Celeste's authorization. Celeste listened to every argument in complete silence, her expression giving nothing away. though anyone watching closely might have noticed how her hands stayed perfectly still on the table, a stillness that came only from tremendous effort. When the room finally quieted waiting for her decision, she looked at Brennan for a long moment, then turned back to her board. "I trust him," she said in a voice that allowed no room for debate. "The investigation continues under his direction, not his dismissal." The room erupted. Several directors openly questioned her judgment, suggesting her personal feelings had compromised her responsibilities to the company and its shareholders. Celeste absorbed it without visible reaction, though something in her posture straightened, some quiet resolve settling over her that hadn't been there moments before. She told them she would take full personal responsibility if her trust proved misplaced, and that until then Brennan would have whatever resources and authority he needed to find the true source of the breach. Brennan asked for only one thing before the meeting adjourned: 24 hours uninterrupted complete access to the server logs and no interference from anyone on the executive floor. Celeste granted it without hesitation, silencing further objection with a single look that made clear the discussion was over. As the room emptied and the tension drained into the hallway, Brennan stayed behind, already pulling up the first lines of code that would either vindicate her trust or destroy everything they'd quietly begun to build. He worked through the night, fueled by cold coffee and the low hum of servers that never slept. The footage presented against him had been altered. He was certain within the first hour, though, proving it meant tracing the manipulation back through layers of metadata most people would never think to examine. Timestamps could be forged easily enough by anyone with sufficient access, but the underlying file structure left traces far harder to disguise: small inconsistencies in compression, artifacts in frame sequencing that revealed exactly when and how the footage had been doctored. By early morning, he'd reconstructed enough of the deleted logs to trace the real pattern of unauthorized access across the previous 18 months, far longer than anyone had suspected. The pattern was careful, deliberate, executed by someone who understood the company's security architecture intimately enough to move through it almost invisibly. Whoever was responsible hadn't stumbled into this by accident. They'd built it methodically over a long stretch of time, extracting proprietary algorithms in small, carefully spaced increments designed never to trip an automated alert. The trail led him to a set of credentials used again and again to reach the most sensitive research files in the company's possession, credentials belonging not to some outside hacker, but to someone deeply embedded within the organization. Brennan cross-referenced the access against employee schedules, travel records, and internal communications, narrowing the field of suspects until only one name held consistent across every single instance: Gordon Halsey. The vice president of technology, a man who'd served on the executive team for nearly a decade, had been quietly selling the company's proprietary algorithms to competing firms for years. He'd built an elaborate structure of shell accounts and disguised transactions to hide the money, confident that his seniority and long tenure placed him beyond suspicion. He was also, Brennan realized, the one person with the access and the motive to alter that security footage and pin the breach on the outsider nobody would think to defend. Brennan didn't go to the board first. He went to Halsey's office alone and set a single printed page on the desk. One line of it highlighted a transfer routed through a shell account back to a competitor's subsidiary. "I know what these are," he said. "I know when you moved them, and I know you built the footage that was supposed to send me out the door instead of you." Halsey started with the practiced ease of a man who'd talked his way out of harder rooms. A contractor's word against a decade of service. No jury alive would take the temp over the VP. Brennan just laid down the next page, and the next, metadata that couldn't be reasoned away. Timestamps reconstructed from logs Halsey thought he'd deleted the money trail drawn end to end. By the fourth page, the ease had drained out of his voice, and by the time he was hauled in front of the board, the full extent of the betrayal came out of him in a confession that left the room speechless. The fallout rolled through the company for weeks. Halsey was terminated immediately and turned over to federal authorities for prosecution. His decade of service revealed as nothing more than a patient, elaborate theft that had cost the company millions in stolen research and lost ground. The board members who'd so confidently accused Brennan days earlier found themselves offering awkward, half-hearted apologies, though none of them ever fully reckoned with how close they'd come to destroying an innocent man on evidence that had been manufactured against him. Celeste said little publicly about the ordeal, handling the aftermath with the same measured composure she brought to every crisis. Privately, though, something in her had shifted for good. She had chosen to trust a man she barely knew over an entire board of experienced executives, and that choice had been proven right in the most public and consequential way imaginable. The experience left her with a clarity she hadn't expected, a growing awareness that her instincts, so long suppressed beneath years of corporate caution, deserved more room to breathe than she'd ever allowed them. Several evenings after the scandal settled and operations returned to something like normal, Celeste found Brennan alone in his temporary office, packing away the last of his equipment. She stood in the doorway a long moment before speaking, watching him work with the same quiet focus she'd noticed the first day when he'd solved in 20 minutes a problem that had defeated an entire department for 3 days. Then she asked the question that had sat unspoken between them since the beginning, since that strange, unplanned moment when a broken computer had revealed a photograph never meant for anyone else to see. "Why didn't you just tell me I was pretty that day?" she asked, the way anyone else would have. It would have been easy, expected, even the kind of harmless compliment that costs nothing and pleases almost everyone. Brennan set down the cable he'd been coiling and considered the question seriously before answering the way he considered every question that actually mattered to him. "Because in that moment, you weren't really asking about your appearance," he said. "You were asking whether anyone still remembered the person you used to be. Before the company, before the boardrooms, before the pressure to look flawless in every photograph. Calling you pretty would have answered a question you didn't ask and missed the one you did." Celeste stood perfectly still, absorbing it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had looked past the image she presented to the world and seen with startling clarity exactly what she'd been searching for, without ever admitting it to herself. Tears gathered in her eyes, and she made no move to hide them, a small but significant departure for a woman who'd spent years training herself never to show weakness in front of anyone, least of all an employee in her own office. She admitted quietly that no one had ever asked her that question before the real one, buried beneath her original words about whether the happy young woman in that photograph still existed anywhere inside the executive, everyone believed they knew. Brennan didn't offer easy comfort. He told her the truth as he understood it, that people don't disappear entirely no matter how deeply they bury themselves under obligation and expectation, and that whatever remained of the laughing young woman in the rain was still there waiting for permission to breathe again. In the weeks that followed, something in Celeste began slowly and almost imperceptibly to shift. She arrived at meetings without the rigid armor she'd worn for years, letting small moments of genuine warmth surface where she once would have kept strict distance. She laughed more easily in casual conversation, surprising employees who'd worked alongside her for years and never once seen her express spontaneous joy. She started declining media appearances that existed only to reinforce her public image, investing that time instead in projects that actually interested her. The change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't without moments of doubt, old habits reasserting themselves whenever pressure mounted or old insecurities resurfaced. But gradually, the distance between the woman in the photograph and the woman running the company began to narrow the gap that had once seemed permanent, closing with each small choice she made to prioritize her own well-being alongside her responsibilities. Employees noticed too, and the atmosphere on the executive floor grew noticeably lighter, the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined the place easing into something more sustainable. Through all of it, Brennan was careful never to take credit for the change he'd helped set in motion. He stayed on with the company on a formal basis. Now his consulting role converted into a permanent position overseeing security architecture. But he never used his proximity to Celeste to seek advantage or push the relationship past what she initiated herself. He never pursued her, never flattered her, never positioned himself as someone owed special attention for what had passed between them. That restraint, more than anything else, was precisely what drew her toward him. She had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something, investors seeking returns, executives seeking influence, suitors seeking the prestige of being tied to a powerful woman. Brennan wanted none of it. He showed up, did his work with quiet competence, and treated her not as a chief executive to be managed or a prize to be won, but as a person deserving of honesty and respect in a world that had spent years reducing her to a title and a net worth. That plain, uncomplicated regard felt like the rarest gift she'd ever received. A year passed marked by steady growth for the company and a quieter, more personal kind of growth that unfolded entirely outside the public eye. Arden Quantum Systems secured several major contracts that had once seemed impossible after the breach, rebuilding its reputation through transparency and stronger internal safeguards that Brennan himself had helped design. On the evening, the company celebrated its biggest achievement, yet a landmark partnership that would define the next decade, the executive floor filled with the kind of energy that comes only from hard-won success. Reporters gathered eager to capture the traditional celebratory photograph of the chief executive standing triumphant before the crowd, the polished image that would run on business publications the next morning. A photographer approached Celeste with practiced efficiency, asking her to pose near the company banner. She declined politely but firmly, surprising him and several nearby staff who'd never once seen her turn down favorable press. Instead, she quietly excused herself, crossing the room to where Brennan stood near the edge of the gathering, deliberately outside the spotlight as he always preferred. She took his hand without a word and led him toward the private balcony off her office, away from the noise and performance of the party still going behind them. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist, the kind Seattle produced almost daily in autumn, settling gently over the city lights below. Celeste held up her phone and asked Brennan to simply stand beside her. Nothing posed, nothing arranged, no careful consideration of angle or light. She smiled without effort, the same unguarded warmth caught years earlier in that photograph he'd stumbled on by accident, and Brennan pressed the button before the moment could pass. They studied the image together, glowing on the screen between them. No filter, no editing, no performance, just two people standing close in the soft evening rain, her smile entirely genuine, his expression quietly content in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or audiences. Celeste looked at it a long moment, comparing it silently to the one still saved from years earlier, the one that had started everything between them on a rainy morning neither of them had expected to matter. Then she looked up at him and asked quietly the same question she'd asked on that first day, though this time her voice carried none of its old fragile uncertainty. "What do you think now?" She wanted to know, looking at this new photograph beside the old one, comparing the woman she used to be against the woman she'd slowly become again over the course of a single transformative year. Brennan looked at the image, then at her standing beside him in the mist with rain gathering softly in her hair. Her expression open in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded woman he'd first met beside a broken computer. He told her simply that she wasn't merely pretty this time. She was happy, genuinely, completely happy. And that quality, the one no camera could manufacture and no styling could fake, was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Celeste smiled again, the same unguarded smile from the photograph, and stepped closer to him, the rain falling gently around them both, as the city lights blurred in the distance. The broken computer that had first brought them together had been repaired long ago. Its malfunction resolved in 20 minutes on an ordinary autumn morning neither of them could have known would change everything. But what Brennan had truly repaired slowly and without ever intending to was something more delicate and more important than any machine. He had helped a woman the world believed untouchable remember how to feel alive again, and in doing so had found something in himself he'd thought was gone for good. Standing together on that quiet balcony above the city with the soft Seattle rain falling and the noise of celebration continuing faintly behind the glass, there was no longer any distance between a powerful chief executive and an ordinary man who fixed broken systems for a living. There was only the two of them present and unguarded exactly as they were. No titles required, no performance necessary. It was in the end a beginning more honest than either of them had ever expected to find, built not on the polish of appearances, but on the quiet, steady truth of being truly seen. If someone ever saw the real you, the way Brennan saw Celeste, tell me about it in the comments. And if this story reminded you that you're more than your title, subscribe, so the next one finds you when you need it.